Key number 7, the biblical calendar and its 2 divisions and 2 cycles, and the Flood Chronicle. Key number 7 was researched and produced by 144,000teachers.org. For seminars, conferences, and enrollment, please contact us at 144,000teachers@gmail.com. For further studies, please visit our website at 144,000teachers.org. The Flood Chronicle, found in Genesis chapters 7 and 8, and Josephus in the autumn season. Josephus dates the flood season in the autumn. He says, this calamity happened in the 600th year of Noah's government, in the 2nd month corresponding to October-November Gregorian reckoning, called by the Macedonians Dius, but by the Hebrews Mar Eshban, for so did they order their year in Egypt. The Flood Chronicle and Philo numbers Tishri as the 1st month. Philo is another important witness supporting the order of months in Genesis. He himself numbers Tishri, corresponding to September-October Gregorian reckoning, as the 1st month of the civil division. It is numbered 7 in the modern Hebrew calendar. The Flood Chronicle, Passover month as the 1st month. But Philo recognizes that at the time of the Exodus, God commanded Moses that the Passover month should be designated as the 1st. The Flood Chronicle and the Paschal month. With reference to the Paschal month, Philo writes, this month, being the 7th both in number and order according to the revolutions of the sun, is the 1st in power, on which account it is also called first in the sacred scriptures. The Flood Chronicle and Josephus, Philo, and the Talmud. These statements of Josephus and Philo are further confirmed by the Talmud, and they appear to be consistent for the following reasons. The flood began in the autumn. Reason number 1, if the flood months began in the autumn, they would then coalesce with the seasons as they have always been in the Near East, rain in fall and spring, and drought in summer. Astronomical tides and months. Reason number 2, according to the numbering of the months, the astronomical tides harmonize with the events described. If the order of the months is reversed, the tides do not check. The Flood Chronicle and the numbering of the months. Reason number 3, the numbering of the months from Tisri, or 7th month, is a key to the length of the months when compared with the periods. But by reversing the order of the months and numbering from Nisan or Abib, or the 1st month, the key thereby becomes useless. The Flood Chronicle and seeding time. Reason number 4, if Noah had left the ark in Iyar, corresponding to April-May Gregorian reckoning, as the 2nd month, he would obviously have had to wait at least 7 months before seeding the ground. The Flood Chronicle, seeding the wheat and sowing barley. But coming forth in Eshban, corresponding to October-November Gregorian reckoning, he could immediately prepare for the November seeding of wheat as is customary in the Near East, and soon after for the January sowing of barley. The Flood Chronicle and the seasons fully established. That the seasons were fully established after Noah left the ark is implied in Genesis chapter 8 verse 22. While the earth remaineth, seeding and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. Continuing with the Flood Chronicle, the calendar opposite of Egypt. The lunar calendar used by Moses, both in the case of the Exodus and in that of the flood, had its new year at the nadir, or the opposite pole of the Egyptian economic scheme of counting time. The Flood Chronicle and the lunar and the solar years. The deluge began in the year 600 of Noah's life, according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 6, and the year changed to 601 on the first day of the subsequent first month, found in Genesis chapter 8, verse 13. This change of year on the 308th day of the flood is indisputable evidence that the calendar was intentionally based upon both the lunar and the solar years. For by adding the 46 days in Tishri and Eshvan before the rain began to 308, we get 354 days, which represents the number in a common lunar year, while by adding to 308 days the 57 days from the change of years to the time Noah left the ark, we get 365 days, which correspond to the solar year. The Flood Chronicle and the earliest historical records. Thus, we have the earliest historical records for the length of the lunar and solar years, and at the same time, the earliest precedent for beginning the Hebrew civil year in the autumn. The Flood Chronicle, a common year, not a leap year. If the lunar portion of the flood period had been a leap year, then it would have contained 13 months, and the 13th month would have been introduced as an additional Adar. The Flood Chronicle, the ark rested in Abib. If Adar, then Abib in which the ark rested would necessarily have been numbered the 8th month instead of the 7th. The Flood Chronicle, Noah left the ark the 2nd month, and furthermore, in the event of a lunar leap year, Noah would have left the ark on the 27th day of the 1st month instead of the 2nd, if he were to carry out the obvious intention of the analyst to mark off the 365 days belonging to the solar year. The Flood Chronicle, a lunar year of 354 days, hence the consistent conclusion that the lunar portion of the flood year was a common lunar year equaling 354 days and not 365 days. The Flood Chronicle, the lunar calculations, the most exact, and with the understanding that Tishri, corresponding to September-October Gregorian reckoning, is the 1st month, the lunar year would obviously have to begin with Tishri and end on the last day of Elul, corresponding to August-September. This is in harmony with the change of year recorded in the text. Lunar calculations are the most exact of all ancient forms of calendation. The Flood Chronicle, a precise solar year of the flood. The solar year is also outlined as heretofore described. A period of exactly 365 days extends from the 17th of Eshvan, corresponding to October-November, when the rain began, to the 27th of Eshvan, when Noah left the ark. These two limiting dates mark out a precise solar year during which the flood prevailed. The Flood Chronicle and the constant companions, solar and lunar years. The difference of 10 days between the two limiting dates is sufficient evidence that Moses actually intended to leave on record the length of the common solar year as a companion constant to the common lunar year. The Flood Chronicle and Schiaparelli notes of the two cycles. She apparently is one of few who has taken note of this coincidence. We cannot doubt that this writer knew the year of 365 days. In fact, he makes the flood begin in the 600th year of Noah's life on the 17th day of the second month. The Flood Chronicle and the 601 year of Noah's life, and the definite drying of the earth and the end of the flood he puts in the 601 year of Noah's life, on the 27th day of the second month. The Flood Chronicle and the month of the Hebrew calendar. These months are certainly those of the Hebrew calendar, that is to say, lunar periods. The flood would therefore have lasted 12 moons and 11 extra days, making it 354 days plus 11 days, equaling 365 days. The Flood Chronicle, the total duration of the flood, 365 days. It is hard not to recognize here the intention of making the flood last for an exact solar year. For if 354 days be assumed for the duration of 12 months, the total of the duration of the flood comes to 365 days. The Flood Chronicle, biblical astronomical constants. Consequently, the calendar in Genesis is also an acknowledgement of the length of the solar year. It is indeed thrilling to find these astronomical constants in the biblical text. The Flood Chronicle, very ancient computations. They represent very ancient computations in calendar science. They would appear to have been introduced early in the page of Holy Writ for the express purpose of pointing to the lunar form of calendar as the one to be used in biblical chronology. The Flood Chronicle and the Autumn New Year. The Genesis calendar is seemingly an historical document of rare antiquity, for it ties together the patriarchal age and the centuries of Israelite slavery under the pharaohs, when the autumn new year of the sons of Jacob belonged to the same season as the Egyptian taught New Year. The Flood Chronicle, a record in chronology. Obviously, Moses had to choose between these two forms of calendation in order to construct this record in chronology. The Flood Chronicle, 1 week before the flood. Let us summarize its various features of importance. Number 1, in this Genesis Chronicle, the dates in themselves are of telling significance. Noah and his family went into the ark a full week before the rain began, according to Genesis chapter 7, verse 4. The Flood Chronicle, the clear light of the full moon. It was on the 10th day of the second month and throughout the week that Noah completed his preparations in the piercingly clear light of the full moon. The Flood Chronicle, the winds and the tides. 5 months later, the ark rested. In the last quarter of this 7th month, the winds and tides have ceased their violence, and the ark is moving about in a quiet haven of water over Ararat. The Flood Chronicle, a new moon and a horned moon. When the patriarch finally leaves the ark, it is close to the end of the second month of the year, and the moon is new. 2, possibly 3 days goes by ere the horned moon slowly sets on the western horizon after the sun, according to Genesis chapter 8, verse 14. The Flood Chronicle, all the phases of the moon. In this series of dates in Genesis, all the phases of the moon are involved. A calendar based upon the moon reveals astronomical events that would pass wholly unnoticed by the wandering ear of Egypt or the later Julian scheme of measuring time. The Flood Chronicle, calendar calculation, not observation. The second feature of essential importance are the nature of the Genesis calendar, that this instrument was calculated and not based upon new moon observation seems incontrovertible, and furthermore, there is no direct evidence that any written sources were at the analyst's command. The Flood Chronicle, when the moon is not seen, and hereby is lifted the uncertainty which has hitherto challenged the whole problem of the ancient lunar month, namely, what happened to the calendar when the moon is not seen. The Flood Chronicle, the calculated new moons. Every scripture date is an answer to this question, for all the dates in the Bible respond to calculated new moons as the synchronism reveal, and is now further supported by the reckoning in Genesis. The Flood Chronicle, very early record. The third feature of great interest to astronomy should be this very early record of indisputable solar and lunar constants, the mean length of the lunar month and year, and the mean length of the solar year. The Flood Chronicle and the original Hebrew calendar. The original Hebrew calendar in organized Israel was founded upon both forms of year. Its months were determined by the course of the moon, while the lunar year itself paced along with the sun's motion by means of the harvest festivals. The Flood Chronicle and the change of calendar. The festal season remained stabilized in Jewry until after the time of Hillel II. In the medieval controversy between the various Jewish sects, one Yefet ben Ali, the Karaite, challenged the opposing rabbinites that they had changed the due seasons of the calendar. The Flood Chronicle and the Genesis computation. Another feature of consequence pertaining to ancient chronology comes to light in this flood study, namely that there are apparently two ways of numbering the lunar months in the Pentateuch, one from Tishri, as in the Genesis computation, a method followed by the Israelite slaves in Egypt, and the second from Nisan, the Abib of Moses, after the Exodus and continuing to this present day. The Flood Chronicle, a chronicle of history. The fifth feature, the Genesis calendar presents about the earliest precedent for beginning the civil year in the autumn. There are also arguments that the creation of the world occurred in this season. The sixth feature, and still another value in the Genesis Chronicle, is of material consequence to the chronology of history. The Flood Chronicle and the calendaric reckoning. For in this calendaric reckoning there occurs so exact an astronomical description of the flood year that in the event of its approximate century being identified, the year itself can certainly be dated. Taken from the Grace Hamadan collection, the Flood Chronicle, pages 1 to 19, excerpts. The Biblical Calendar and other applications today. The Biblical Calendar, two divisions, civil and religious, may be identified from Genesis to Revelation. There are other applications of the Biblical Calendar which can be found today and will be unlocked in key number 8.